Hello, welcome to another episode of Western Tabletop. Today I'm actually going to talk about my Iron Signet entry for this year, which was Grimgore Ironhide. I'm actually going to talk a bit about the event, but mainly about what I'm going to call P, which is Prep, Execution, Entry and Exit. This is something that in my head I'd put together to understand the journey that I was going on for my painting, and when I initially put the first prime undercoat on the model, what was I going to get out of it? What was I looking for? Why am I painting the miniature? And painting miniatures can be a very mundane task for those that just were like me for a long time. I just wanted to get some paint on the models so that I could play games. I didn't actually care about how well detailed those models were. I didn't particularly care about whether I was pushing my limits as a painter. It was about tabletop ready, to be fair, barely tabletop ready, quick as I could and get it done. Now that's not a problem. I did that for many, many years. I have lots and lots of painted miniatures. But there did come a time where I had a miniature in particular that I had always said, I am not going to paint this miniature until I am good enough, until I can do it justice. Some of you probably have a miniature, maybe more than one, that also fits into this category. And for me, it was Grimgore Ironhide. He was one of the first fantasy orc models that I'd purchased as a general to lead my army way back in what would have been the beginning, I think, of 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy, moving into 7th and then 8th edition before the end times and the changes that brought across Age of Sigmar. Many, many games that I play with that model, always in bare metal, and played with him so much as bare pewter metals that he actually tarnished. And his shoulder blades, that he had the shoulder armor plates that he has on, and his axe actually got the dark metal patina staining on it because of oil residue from my hands and the number of times that I'd picked that model up and moved him around and placed him in different places. And I didn't care where I was picking him up because he wasn't painted. So I just grabbed the biggest surfaces that I could. Fast forward to, 2022, and I've decided that it is time. It is time to paint Grimgore Ironhide. It is time to pick that model up and actually give him a paint job that's worthy of sitting in my display cabinet instead of being packed away in an army transport case with, not even primer on him. He was one of the models of shame that I had. And like I said, most of us have a couple where we just don't want to talk about them that often because it's just like, I should have done him years ago. And I got stuck in the rut of, well, I'll paint him when I'm a better painter. But as I was just saying, majority of my painting was just to get it painted. It wasn't about quality, wasn't about stretching my skill. It wasn't about finding new opportunities to paint bravely and experiment. And it certainly wasn't doing anything to get him painted. In fact, it was a lot of procrastination in most cases. So Iron Signet is it proved to be the motivation that got the model done for me, but that wasn't the only motivation. I did have this underlying motivation that it was time to get what I would see as a challenge model for myself, a blocker in my hobby. It was time to get that thing removed and get some paint on it. I'll give a quick retrospective of Iron Signet from my point of view. I don't enter painting competitions, so that was a brand new experience for me. The admin and the crew and everyone that was there that was helping set up alongside, like with the objectives secured, I felt that whilst they certainly looked chaotic at the beginning of the day trying to understand everything, I fully appreciate that they were probably under the pump with a million questions and only 4 people at any given point in time able to answer those questions. Generally, it was only one person available at any given time to answer questions. But they did a remarkable job. I think it was a highly successful event. They're going to talk about it themselves later on, and so I'm not going to cover it too much more than that, except it's well worth it. They accept any sort of type of model in terms of scale models, fantasy models, sci-fi models, anything you want to bring in to showcase your work or put into the competition. You can, it's easy. And the one thing that I would say is you can enter anything on the exhibit display, and the exhibit display table was a free to enter table where you could just put stuff out. But the real showcase is what comes in that painting competition. So just be aware that when you are entering a painting competition, even though the prize structure operates differently, there is a certain quality that you should try to aim for. When painting, always try to paint your best for this, because there is that competition layer. That being said, if all you're able to manage, or if you're just getting started and you're just putting base colors on a model, go for it. They encourage it. You will get good feedback. You will get really solid feedback on how to help do your models a bit better, if that's what you want to chase. Having done it now, chase it as early as you can, because you will learn things that make the rest of your painting not that much harder, but significantly better results. But anyway, that's a retrospective, and I don't want to talk about it too much because that's going to get covered somewhere else. So let's just go through a little bit of a time vortex and travel back in time. So we're currently in October. I'm going to go back to July 2022. I was fairly comfortable with my work, so I didn't have too many stresses from there happening, and a few other bits and pieces that were going on that meant I felt a bit more comfortable over considering doing a model as a display model for CYGNET. I looked at all the stuff and the photos that I could see from last year's CYGNET, and I went, you know what, last year I put some exhibition stuff out and it was great, but really, I know a lot of these techniques. I haven't practiced a lot of the techniques, and so I really need to put those two things together and actually get some practice on a model. So July 3rd, that is when Grimgor Ironhide took his first steps to being the painted model. He got his primer coat on. So I did a zenithal primer, and you'll see with the photos that are coming across as I talk about it, the primer was adequate. I actually, it just came straight out of rattle cans, Games Workshop rattle cans, and so there are some challenges inherent with using those in that way. And I only say adequate because where I actually put the primary light source coming down was actually off the back of his left shoulder. Whilst I got enough highlight of the white paint over the grey on his face and the front of the model, as I got into the painting process later, that was not the best placement for that zenithal highlight. But I didn't think enough about it to go. At this point, I was like, hey, Grimgor is going to get painted. This is going to be great. But I should have spent just that little bit longer to think about when and how are people going to look at the model. And you have to look for that golden angle where people are going to stand at it and you're going to see it is on a rotating display cabinet, or display base, sorry, in my display cabinet. So I can get away with that. But most of the time, the model's going to be viewed front on. You're going to see their face. You're going to see either their, their open poses or slightly more closed-in poses, depending on what you've got, obviously. But you need to think about that. That's one thing which it made my job harder in certain places later on, which I'll try to comment on. And it certainly made the zenithal prime certainly does help to give you a light and dark modulation flow as the undertone for your painting, and that's great. But you do need to think about where that light source is coming from, because especially when I get into the next step, it determines almost everything about what I was about to do. So in the preparation, and once I had him primed, I then had to try and get an understanding of how am I going to paint him? Like Grimgor as a model, he's probably, I've seen some very, very nice orc models of several different scales. Obviously got a lot of Games Workshop new stuff coming out as well. Some awesome stuff done by third-party sculptors. There's some really cool stuff out there. Grimgor for me though, because I have the psychological attachment to all the games that I played with him, and I was in that Warhammer lore and stuff at the time, like he is the absolute pinnacle of what an aggro orc to me would be like. So he's a black orc that basically, he was upset that he couldn't find a good fight in the Empire, so he went down into the Skaven caves where basically they had innumerable Skaven, and he spent months and months and months just slaughtering Skaven because he was just so bloodthirsty that if he was a Chaos Warrior, undoubtedly he would be a Khorne Lord, without a shadow of a doubt. But the thing is, when he's an orc, he's just really resembling the violence of Gork or Mork, depending on which way they do it. But so I went, right, okay, so he's going to be, I've got to think about how he's going to look. I want him to fit into the archetype of what typically the Black Orc armor was, which he always led a retinue of Black Orcs. I want him to be, so I want his armor to be dark, but I want his skin to be a bit more vibrant. I really want the armor of the human head that he holds to be standing out, to be quite different. I want to be able to do those different metals and get those different highlights. And that's when I was coming around to the idea of, well, one of the techniques that I've seen lots of people do, and there's lots of different ways to do it, lots of different ways to create texture, but I've seen, quite a few people do using non-metallic metals. So using whites, grays, blues, other shades to create the illusion that it's a shiny metal. And this is probably, I guess, where my real challenge came in, is I had never really painted non-metallic metal before. And so this was going to be a real big push of my skill, a real stretch, but a real learning journey. Now, one of the things that in the preparation that I should have paid more attention to but didn't was that when you go to paint a model in the miniature world, typically you look for all of the possible mold lines. Yeah, if you saw the model, you would all have seen it. If you haven't seen the model but you've built a model, you typically know what I'm talking about. So because Grimgor was a white pewter metal model, he was cast out of two halves of a mold. His arm and his head separate off his body, the axe arm that is. And the axe arm had a giant mold line which I hadn't been able to remove because I simply, before priming him, didn't get to that step. And then after I primed him, I didn't realize that it was there. And then we get from where I was on July 3rd, getting excited, feeling good, have put together a bit of a plan on what I would paint him in and the style. And I get to July 7th and I realize on July 7th, there's this stupid mold line. Now by that point on July 7th, I'd put the first coat of paint down on his skin, which was a very dark green. And I put that down and I was like, oh, maybe I'll be able to, I'll paint it like a bit of leather strap or a bit of metal. So then, as I was like, okay, I need to just put this down because I'm getting a little bit demotivated by the fact that there's this mold line there. And if I attempt to go at it with my file now, or possibly a hobby knife now, I risk damaging the actual model. I risk damaging the rest of his arm. I risk damaging, slipping and cutting something or putting a chunk in. Now on most of his armor, an extra chunk out of his armor wouldn't look amiss. In fact, I carved a couple of extra scratches in him, but very subtly. They were in subtle places, so they weren't detracting from the overall impact of the model, but it did make the plates look a bit more beaten up, which is what I wanted. But I didn't want to risk doing that and undoing all my hard work and putting another layer of paint on. So instead, I chose to continue. Now this should be a warning to anybody that's wanting to do competition level painting. You should always, as soon as you find that spot, if you are thinking that you are not early enough in the project to change it, my recommendation is bite the bullet, make the change, repaint the area. The earlier you find it, the better it will be, but the reality is that the longer you leave that flaw there, and such a critical flaw, the more frustrated on painting that area of the model you're going to get as you continue to put layer over layer, hoping it's somehow magically going to get better because you're going to paint it like a bit of metal or a strap later. So that got me past then the preparation piece physically. I'd had the base color of the skin down. I was committed now, because for me that's typically how I work. Like once I put a bit of paint on something with a determination and a motivation, I will be able to get it done. But then there was the mental preparation side as well. So I knew I was going in to paint non-metallic metals. I knew that that was new for me. I knew that there was going to be challenges in that. I knew that I was going to have to go and talk to people for feedback. I knew that I didn't know it all, and that if I didn't get feedback on it, I was going to end up with a miniature that I wasn't happy with. Yes, I would have done it by myself, but I wouldn't have achieved my potential. So part of the preparation was I started advertising everywhere in a way that I was going to do Grimgore. And I started throwing pictures all over socials, all over the Discord groups that I was part of. I started spamming friends with Grimgore. And what I was trying to do was build a set of touch points in the painting community that was connected to me, local to me. Actually, in some instances, not local to me, but a bunch of touch points where I can go later on down the track, hey, here's how my progress of Grimgore is going now. And I would get, you know, different bits of feedback. I would be able to, oh, look, it looks really good. You're doing really well. Keep it up. That source of motivation proved critical. Then there was the part of the preparation where I go, I have to decide now, right now, before I go any further, I have to decide whether or not I want him to place in the competition. So the ultimate end goal was get him into the competition. Now that's fine, that's buying an entry ticket. So I knew that I was going to be able to tick that box. I then had to decide in that space, okay, so I'm going to be able to put him on display, that's fine. But do I actually want him to place? Do I actually want him to be in a position where he might actually bring something back as a win? Bearing in mind, the iron signet structure is different to a 1, 2, 3 placing. And I ultimately had to turn around to myself and say, if the purpose is to stretch my painting skill, and if the purpose is to grow and try different techniques and go through the painful process that it is to fail, because I personally struggle with that quite a lot, I think I have to put myself out there as an earnest attempt to win. Now, not necessarily win a gold signet ring or even a silver signet medallion or signet level, but to qualify as a bronze up-and-coming sort of painter, a bronze up-and-coming spot. I feel that's achievable. I feel that is something that I can aim for. I think that I can push my limit and push my painting skill to a point where that would be within reach. Now, there were no guarantees. I didn't know whether I was going to be able to pull it off. I had a white and grey model with green skin and a giant mold line. So I really didn't know. And at that point, again, if I'd spent a little bit longer, I would have cleaned that mold line off. But I decided that I would give it a go. I decided that I'm going to paint this model with the intent that he would represent well in the competition. He may not win anything, but I would like him to be almost like an underdog that could, you know, I don't normally paint like this. I'm going to try and paint like this. And it'd be cool to see that that is actually good enough to have it being done. Like I said, I've done a lot of reading over sort of approaching 2 decades worth of being in this hobby and scale modeling. I know a lot of theory on how to apply lots of different techniques. Theory is only part of it. Theory tells you the concept of how to do something. You have to practice to make it work. And I'd done no practice. So this was a fairly significant challenge, but we grow most when we're challenged. So I thought, okay, so what was the first thing I did? I think it was July 15th, somewhere around there, 11th to 15th in that week. I put Grimgore down and I started a completely different model. And that model that I actually started is termed the White Ninja, which is a little bit of a play on words. He's a ninja model from the Reaper Bones miniature line. Pretty cool model. Made of a very flexible resin plastic, and so it has almost a rubbery texture. For those that don't know what the Bones line looks like, yeah, it's a very soft surface to actually paint on. Really bad for cleaning up mold lines. Really, really bad. Anyway, so I did that and I went, if I want to work on non-metallic metal, I have to get transitions and blending and vibrancies in color at a level that I have never done before. So I don't want to just immediately just try that on Grimgore. I need to do a bit of a test model and just see, are the brushes that I've got, do they work? Are the paints that I've got, do they work? Do I understand how to actually apply it? Or is it all just theory based and I need to go back to the drawing books and actually go, you know what, maybe non-metallic metal is not going to work? Because the smoothness of the blend and the transitions, and if I could do it with white and get something nice and get something that I was comfortable with, in my head, I was like, well, then I can do it with grays and blacks and a little bit of blue, which was sort of right. The miniatures were quite different. The White Ninja was covered in cloth. Grimgore was covered in hard armor panels. So the two models' aesthetics look quite different. There was also a scale difference. The White Ninja model is closer to a 20mm figure, maybe 25mm tall, a much more fragile looking sculpt. Grimgore is not that. Grimgore is basically the opposite of all of that. But in my head it made sense that I did this guy, the White Ninja, and I would try to just work on getting smoothness, work on getting some fine detail, and I used him as a test bed to, you know, just work on some leather scratch patterning and some, you know, some other bits and pieces which, you know, I wasn't super comfortable with at the end, but you know what, it actually gave me the experience, and that meant that I didn't try it on Grimgore and then have to spend longer reworking it and reworking it and reworking it because I wasn't happy. I could try the technique and I went, I actually don't like that. And if I don't like it, I'm not going to put it on my big model. So that was quite useful. The whites and the transitions for the whites, there's actually a lot less of the blend of the whites than what I had in my head that it would be. The white was blended up from like a cream color, and so it looks like a Hessian material very well, but with a vibrancy on it. I like it. It went well, but I looked at it and I went, I don't want my cloth that I do on Grimgore, in the few areas where there is a fabric, I don't want the transition to look like that. I don't want the transition to be in the way that I painted it. Now with the White Ninja, remember I'm trying to paint how I would naturally, but just at a higher consistency or a higher level of smoothness. I'm not actually changing the technique in how I paint or the layers in how I paint. I'm just trying to be smoother about it. Very different things. So we get a little bit further, and so I get that miniature finished. I take those learnings away, and I go, these are the things I like, these are the things I didn't like. And then I decide I need to do another one. I need to get some more practice, so I grabbed another RPG miniature that I had. I spent a bit more time working on that. So through July, the first or the middle portion of July, I was actually painting stuff that wasn't Grimgore, but the intent was all the learnings that I was picking up out of that, I would be able to use on Grimgore or with Grimgore. Come the end of July, last 3 days, I picked Grimgor back up and started chomping away at him again and started working up the skins, just gentle transitions, sending those photos out to my group of contacts who are trying to get feedback, trying to go, it's looking good, or that transition's too much of a contrast. It needs to be blended down more, like the line is too solid, in the style that I was trying to paint with. And they were all very much aware of why I was painting Grimgor, and so they knew that I wasn't going for the penultimate competition piece, but that I was very much wanting to push my painting limit. And I went through and wrote out all the different dates where I took the photo montages that I was sending around, and that was a very interesting experience, because what I was noticing, so in July I had a couple of photo snaps at the beginning of July, a couple of photo snaps at the end of July. Through August, it was about once every 5 or so days, so about once a week, which makes sense. Typically I was painting one night a week at that point. And there'll be a string of snaps that are coming through. And then we got to September. Now September, I was like, right, I've only got this much time left, because October was go live for Iron Signet. And I actually said that in my head, to make sure I had time, I said that go live was October 1. Now I might have been getting confused because I was working on some projects at the time which I had just got put onto, which had a whole bunch of go lives in October. So it just made sense that October 1 was the go live date, because if I wasn't ready by October 1, the project work might get in the way, and then Grimgor wasn't going to get finished. That was unacceptable. So go live became October 1, and I stripped 2 weeks off of the schedule that I originally had planned for. Which meant that September, let me have a look here, I painted almost every single day in September. I went from doing 1 day a week, so 4 days across a month, to slowly, and there were longer paint sessions. I was probably still doing it for 4 to 5 hour paint sessions. And then I started doing 4 to 5 hour paint sessions a day. Some of them were actually significantly longer than that. I think the longest that I did a painting session for, I had 1 day free and ended up doing, I think it was 9 or 10 hours, split in sort of 3 sections throughout the day. And that was a level that I'd never, or I guess a consistency that I'd never painted at in terms of that amount of time. I got into a really good rhythm, got into a really good groove of just understanding what I was doing, where I was putting the next layer of highlight, what I was working on. Obviously, I'd broken Grimgor into several sections to paint, which you'll see in the photos that are coming across. So as those days are going forward, I'm picking the next area to work on Grimgor, rather than the typical approach, which was everything silver goes silver, everything brown goes brown, everything green goes green, or whatever. I actually broke it down to go, I'm yes working with those colors, but I'm taking each of those armor panels and I'm going from black where they are all the way up through the transitions and highlights and shadings into the non-metallic metal, and I don't stop until that's finished. Sometimes I did more than one panel at a time. Sometimes I did a grouping of smaller panels. But yeah, it was going from woe to go, essentially each panel, give or take 4 to 5 hours, thereabouts. And in September, I was doing that almost every day. I didn't really have any way of keeping track of time, of exactly how much time I'd been spending on the miniature. I can only really do that now, looking back and actually seeing the different photo snaps that I took over time. And even that's going to be a little bit inaccurate, because I know that I was coming in here sometimes and I'm like, oh, I've got 15 minutes spare. I know I can work with this layer, which is a different part of Grimgor. I can just sort of get that on there as the base for what was going to happen, that night or the night after or whatever. And so, I estimate that I've probably spent somewhere between 125 to 130 hours on Grimgor. Now, that is unheard of for any miniature I've ever painted before. I typically, at 130 hours, I'd expect that I'd be able to get through an army's worth of stuff for certain things. If I actually sat down, like for example, if I take my American Civil War Union or Confederate armies, a single stand of those models, all the way through to getting how I do them with a, I don't actually put base mixture on there like sand or anything. Like I do just paint those greens, so that does take up a little less time. But doing all their flags, their washing, their primary colors, and the method that I use, which is completely about speed painting them, I will do one stand of 20 figures, which is 2 rows of soldiers, fully complete in 1 hour, from bare plastic through prime into finished product. I can get that done in an hour. Now, let's call it an hour and a half for drying time of the wash and the spray rattle can. But if we took just the hour, it's like, so you're telling me that I could do, it was 130 hours. We're gonna, do it and work it out. And I almost, in the same amount of time that I spent painting Grimgore, I literally could have painted what I had of my Confederates like twice over. So I've got 6 regiments that are painted right now with some auxiliary stuff, and I could have painted that twice over in the same amount of time as it took to do Grimgore. That's pushing upwards of 1,000 miniature soldiers in the time it took to do one. But so that was a very new experience for me, because I've never given a model that much attention. What I found during this execution process of going through and actually painting, it was incredibly rewarding. Not only to see the progress on a model that I wanted to get painted, but actually, as I was working my way through and around the miniature, you could see that I was getting better at the non-metallic metal techniques. During execution was also the point that I realized that non-metallic metal is simple as a concept, complicated to achieve, but also the truth is somewhere in the middle. The more that you do it, the more comfortable you get with understanding where the light would go, and therefore where your reflections are going to go. The more that you participate in getting your blending right and your shading right, you can get really nice transitions. That's all just practice. The thing that I wasn't quite ready for was the stunning realization that 90% of Grimgore's model surface is a type of metal, whether it be a strap or a buckle, his axe, his bottom hilt of the axe, the helmet that the Imperial Knight is wearing who's been decapitated, all the plate armor, the gut armor, the little shoulder plate shield. On Grimgore's tooth, he has well, mine's gold, but he has a gold capped tooth. Once I committed to do non-metallic metal, that all had to be non-metallic metal, because if any of it wasn't non-metallic metal, it would ruin the illusion, because you'd immediately, your brain would go, wait, that's metal, which means this is wrong, and it doesn't look right. I'm sure there is a way to put true metallic metals and non-metallic metals relatively close to each other on the same model and not have it look shocking. I was not that guy. I was not that guy. So what I then had to do in that process of execution, as I was, about to start each panel, my wife, who has got an artist background, she helped me sit down, and we tried to assign the rough, basic geometric shapes against the armor panels to understand where the light goes. We drew it out on paper. I practiced shading with a pencil to understand where it was going to go. And all of this stuff is stuff that sort of blends that preparation and execution piece together. But I never, I never would have gone to that effort of understanding if I hadn't have done those things and I just slapped the paint on, and if I tried to, for example, just wet blend a non-metallic metal piece. First of all, I haven't really wet blended that much, so that was dangerous. Second of all, the wet blending, it gives a different impression for the non-metallic metal than what I was going for. That's generally a lot smoother and a lot of the shinier, almost pitching towards chrome non-metallic metal with the real shine. I actually didn't want that for Grimgore. Grimgore, I wanted his metal to be non-metallic metal, but dirty, dark and dingy, and like a dark beaten iron as opposed to a shiny chrome. And so that was completely, just completely different and off base. So I had to draw it out, and then I had to understand, okay, if this is where the chrome finish would be, what does that look like for my armor panel? And going through that process and the execution was really, really good, really enjoyable, like actually trying to use a pencil to understand the shading and where it all fits. Yeah, really, really, really good. And that then gets us to the point of entry. And so this was entry into the competition and what needs to happen by this point. So by this point, Grimgore's painted. I've got Grimgore's plinth ready. I've got everything. Technically, I had a stand-in plinth ready, and then I had the plinth that I purchased on the day. I had Grimgore ready to go. But then I needed to work through the mental process of like, I'm about to take a model that I have spent more time painting than ever, and I'm about to go put him in a room full of other painters who have spent twice, 3 times, 4 times as many hours on their miniature than I have on Grimgore. I hadn't done anything special for Grimgore's base, and so I was going to have to look at everyone's amazing display techniques that they were using on their bases, their incorporated models. Now, when you've just spent 2 months painting a single model better than you ever have before, and then you realize that you're going to go into a room, put your model down on the table, get a photograph, which is going to look amazing because it's the best work you've ever done. So that's never going to change. It's going to always look amazing. And then you're going to go and put it down next to somebody, and it's almost like you put it down and you go, the guy next to you is like a Golden Demon winner. Now, no one is ever going to turn around and say your paint job looks bad. That's poor etiquette at a painting competition, and so that's not going to happen. Any sort of talk like that shouldn't be encouraged. What should be encouraged is the, oh, your miniature looks fantastic, you've done this, you've done that, or, if you ask for feedback, then you'll get that constructive criticism, but they should be giving you those praise points as well, those things that are going, I like what you did this, and I like how this worked. They might even ask you how you got that effect, and you might be able to tell them, it was a contrast, it was a wash, or like, or actually that took me about 20 hours to get right. I was going backwards and forwards with the color variation and the modulation. What you will always do yourself, and there are several painters that will attest to this, is you'll always suffer from that imposter syndrome thing of like, my miniature is not as good and is not worthy to be here. And you put it down and you look at everyone's and you go, yep, that was right. These are all amazing. That's one of the biggest things that Iron Signet tries really hard to combat, because you're not being judged in direct competition for a 1, 2, 3 position against the other competitors. You're being judged based on your model's own merit. The judges will review your model based on its own merit. There is still the point is to still put in fantastically painted miniatures. So there is still a standard that is a measuring stick. But the thing is, your measuring stick that you get used with is still the same as the guy next to you. But what it allows is the guy next to you might have been painting for an extra 20 years more than you, has simply done it more, has simply got a different range of paints that allows the vibrancy to come through with less effort or more effort. Higher pigment concentrations, they look different. You can often tell some of the different paint ranges or the techniques that are applied. So Games Workshop is very a classic, where their typical painting method is base color, wash, layer up those initial foundation colors, highlight 1, highlight 2. For tabletop armies, for tabletop miniatures, that's perfect. Really is. You get a very good quality end result. It's visually striking. There is a reason that they continue to say this is a great way to get started painting. It's because it is. Now, when you go to somewhere like CYGNET, those models that are painted in that way, they will still look good, but they will struggle probably to place too far. And I'm not trying to be critical there. What I'm trying to say is that in the painting competition, it's not about just simply following that recipe approach across your entire model. And I'm talking as if they followed those steps across their entire model. Like, the model will look good, but the transitions and the blends, for example, will always have that static line, and they won't necessarily be blended up into that transition. That basic Games Workshop technique, or basic miniature painting technique, I guess, doesn't focus on giving you the freedoms to say, I want my leather to have a bit of texture, so I'm going to stipple some variation of color on there and then shade to bring it all together. It would just say, paint it a flat color, put a wash over it, edge highlight. Not wrong, but different, and not necessarily what you want to be doing for a painting competition. So I had to work through that process, and I had to actually work up the courage to choose to be vulnerable, to choose to be open to negative feedback or constructive criticism. People will always offer it as constructive criticism. The biggest thing is that you need to take it as constructive criticism and not in your own head turn it around as negative feedback. That's going to force a negative psychological attachment to that. You don't want that. You want to go, everything is constructive feedback. How I choose to adapt and overcome on the next miniature is how I action that feedback. So putting it down, and there were some incredible miniatures on display, and it's very easy for me to turn around and say that Grimgor was not at the level of those models that won the gold CYGNETs. He just wasn't. And not just because of that mold line. My transitions on non-metallic metal, whilst he looks fantastic from everything else I've painted ever, the lines could be sharper. The transitions could be smoother. In particular, the transitions could be stippled or speckled on to create a more natural graduation of color, as opposed to what I did do, which was more lines of transition. Towards the end, things got, the model and some of the highlights, they got very stark on me. And that's because I had to, when I got about 3/4 of the way through the model, I had to redo my paint combination, my paint mixes that I was using, and they didn't quite turn out the way they had for the other 3/4 of the model. So there is a slight variation in the strength of the highlights, in the consistency of the paints. That is not something that exists on these other models, on the winners. So that entry mindset is about making sure that when you're going in, it's choosing the learning mindset, which is something that I find myself saying more and more these days, and especially after having chats with Gorchin and the crew and a whole bunch of other people at work, where it's about, I need to learn from these experiences and not be afraid of them. And it's okay not to get everything right. And it's okay not to be perfect. Perfect is an illusion. So I put him down, had him ready to go. I then went and enjoyed 2 of the tutorials that were on at the day. I simply said to myself, he's done. I got him painted. That was the primary objective for me. That was the reason why I entered. That was why I did my preparation. That is what I focused on during execution. And now he is sitting on that table, complete, the model that I always said that I would paint when I'm good enough. And now I look at him and I can say, I am good enough. I can say, I did paint that. I can say, he's the best miniature I've ever painted. And he took me about 130 hours worth of effort, and I can't wait for the next one. I couldn't do that back in July. I would struggle to do that over some of my other miniatures that I thought were well painted back in July. And I look at them next to Grimgore and I go, yeah, they were okay. Grimgore's better. But I also spent like infinitely more time on Grimgore, but that's how it works. You spend more time, you get a better result. You get a better refined result. Did the tutorials, came back, and then we get through to the awards, the notable exceptions, and there was some fantastic artwork on display. I'm really looking forward to seeing next year and following up on a few different people and watching their progress and their painting styles. So cutting to the chase, Grimgore did secure a bronze medallion award, so a bronze Iron Signet award in the Iron Born category, which I was extremely chuffed about, as that was the upper limit of what my expectations were, is that he would be good enough to potentially qualify at that entry level. And he did. The next part of the exit was then to try and chat with the different judges or the different people who I respected their work, and so I wanted to understand some of their views on painting. I didn't specifically ask about my model. Yeah, call it a missed opportunity. I have their phone numbers, I can always ask. But the reality is, the next model that I do, that will be the one that I want to push to go, okay, I've gone out for my test drive. It turns out that I really enjoyed that, and I want a bit more. So what am I going to do for Iron Signet 2023? Or the next painting comp, for example, a Best in the West? What am I going to do to fit that gap to put it in? How am I going to take what I've learned, take the feedback from everybody that I've had so far, and push that into a new model with a new determination and motivation? Because the thing about models that look good and look really good, you can't stop at one. And I think that's the realization that probably hit the most, is I have come away from Iron Signet being more motivated to actually pick up a paintbrush than I was when I was painting Grimgore. And when I was painting Grimgore, I thought I was the most motivated I'd ever been to pick up a paintbrush because I was painting Grimgore. But now it's about stretching my skills even further. I want to go more. I don't know what the next model will be, but what can I do? How can I increase that painting standard? So when you're leaving a particular event like this, don't be discouraged. If you put something on the table, you did it, you got there. Congratulations. And then focus on, what are the things to learn? Where can I improve? Who other people I can talk to give me that information. And if you're doing it and having fun, it's pretty hard to say that you're doing it wrong. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed the retrospective that I've taken you on, the little journey. I hope you're feeling motivated, maybe if not a little bit inspired. If you haven't seen any of the stuff that was going on at Iron Signet, I thoroughly encourage you to either go next time, or definitely go next time, but jump on any of the socials you can find attached to it. There is some really awe-inspiring stuff out there that's actually just in Perth, not even overseas, not even, elsewhere in those big wide areas of our hobby. I'm talking just locally. We have some incredible painters who'll be more than happy to help, and also just share cool models and cool paint jobs. Alright everybody, well that's going to wrap up what I was talking about today, and the P, which is preparation, execution, entry and exit. There's probably some other proper, more formal name for that. The learning mindset comes to mind, so does intentional practice. Those terms should be familiar to you if you've listened to the podcast before, or Western Tabletop. But yeah, just enjoy your painting journey. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and enter a competition, but do it with the learning mindset. I think you'll be surprised how much you enjoy it. All right, everyone. Bye.